Hello and welcome to Behind the Lines. I'm Diane Dayton. Today we're going to talk about really a missing piece with the Fulton Theatre history. And the missing piece is the working title that Elaine Bledsoe, who is an author, is working on right now. Thank you for being here, Elaine.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
This is so fascinating because we know a lot of things about the history of the Fulton, but this I don't think most of us know, and I'm glad you're doing it. And your mother, back in the 1930s during the Depression, actually owned the theater. Let's start to get into some of this background.
Yes, she did. She actually was a very young widow. Her husband had the belief that the Fulton Theatre was a great place to start selling talking movies. He felt there was going to be a market for it. And he had actually gone to Philadelphia to open another theater when he had a heart attack and died very unexpectedly at a very young age, and left her as a very wealthy widow with a small child, my older sister, who was only about 3 years old at the time. So my mother was thrown into a working world, a business world, that she was completely unfamiliar with, and most women were not doing during that time.
Wow. And she really has quite a story. She was even a pilot.
Absolutely. Clarence Egan, who was the projectionist at the theater at the time, taught her how to fly. She had her own Piper Club, and she loved doing it. Actually, she flew for several years until she had to start filing flight plans, and at that point, she just decided it wasn't as much fun anymore.
Yeah. Now, I know when you were a very little girl, you didn't want to go to daycare. You wanted to go to the theater with your mother, right?
Absolutely. I can remember there was a daycare that was on the corner of Orange and Prince Street, and my mother tried to drop me off there one day, and I just cried and hid behind her skirt, and she finally relented and said, well, I guess I'm going to have to take you along. So most of my very young years, my childhood, I spent sitting in the back of the theater on the days that my mother was working, waiting for her to come down from the office upstairs. And when I knew it was getting close to the time for her to make an appearance, I would sit on the steps at the bottom of the staircase and just wait for her to come down from the office.
Yeah, you have fond memories of all that, don't you?
It's really interesting because Mr. Bonstein, who was the manager at the time, would come down to rout the rowdy boys that would be running around making a lot of noise and disturbing his patrons. And I was always a little bit afraid of him, but he was very kind to me and often would come down, and there was a candy machine right in the corner at the first landing of the staircase, and he would put a nickel in there and come up with a box of green mint leaves, which were my absolute favorite, and I just lived to hear that whoosh of the candy coming out of the machine and the snap of the lever that he pulled, and he would kind of give me a wink and hand the candy over to me.
Yeah. We're talking about this theater being alive during the Depression. I mean, this was a great outlet for people, wasn't it? And what was it, 10 cents or something?
It was 10 cents, and my mother always told me that people came in order to get away from the bad things that were going on in the world, and for 10 cents they could come in out of the cold if it was a cold day, and many of them maybe didn't have heat or were homeless, and during the summertime it was much cooler in the theater as well. The peanut gallery, which was up on the third floor, were the cheapest seats in the house. And at the time, the Fulton was unfortunately segregated. So that's where the African-American people had to sit, was up on that peanut gallery.
Yeah. And we look at what the theater is now and how it has expanded. But it's because I think she kept this going, right?
She kept it going for 20 years. From the time her husband had it until the 1950s, the middle 1950s, and then it was taken over by a theater art company, and they showed some third-rate films. But it was really interesting during the time that she had it because they sold cereals to her. Serial
Yes.
serials, and they were sort of like watching soap operas because you would come back every week for a different installment. And I can remember one time she got really upset with the company that sold it to her because they had it was a western, and there was an Indian that came riding across the screen wearing a pair of white bucks on the horse, and that wasn't very authentic to her. So interesting films that they had during that time.
Yeah. And we were talking, I believe, about the projectionist too. Did he also play?
Yes, Clarence Egan was very talented. He was a projectionist. He was a non-union projectionist, and often the tape would break, and he would have to fix it. And you'd hear a lot of booing going on down in the audience until he was able to get it spliced back together again, which he was very capable of doing. But there was an organ in one of the niches in the front of the theater, and when the movies were not talkies, they were playing the organ in order to dramatize some of the different events going on the screen. And he, after they started with talking films, would still play in the beginning of the film or in a break in the film. Very accomplished organist as well. He actually even taught me how to play the organ. I had piano lessons, but I'd never played the organ before. So he gave me a lot of lessons on how to play the organ.
So much of your life was there. To what age, Elaine?
Until she sold it, probably about age 12. And it's interesting because a lot of kids wanted to be my best friend because they got to go to the movies for free.
Okay. Well, I think one of the things you told me that got you started on this was finding a little diary and diaries.
I found a diary when my mother lost her husband. There was a lot of legal turmoil going on because he had been married before and his wife had died, and there were several stepchildren. And there was a lot of fighting going on over the estate. He had owned several apartment buildings and was in the process of opening another theater. So her sister and her husband were getting ready to go to South Africa. Her husband was being offered the position to open an Armstrong Cork Company property in South Africa, and his wife was pregnant, my mother's sister. So my mother was asked to go along, and so for about a year and a half she was in South Africa, and I found the diary among some things I was cleaning out, which gave me a timeline of exactly when she left New York and when she returned and all of the adventures she had while she was in South Africa. She came back with a lot of artifacts. I actually have a room that's kind of dedicated to many of the African artifacts that she brought back with her. Very interesting to me my whole entire life, that time she spent there.
Wow, that's fascinating. I can see this moving in another direction as you continue to work on this as well.
Exactly,
Yeah.
yes.
She was born when and passed when? What were the dates of her life?
She was born in 1908, and she died about 25 years ago.
Okay.
She lived to be about 86. And through her life, she had a number of health issues. She was no longer allowed to drive because she had a seizure disorder. And she had both grand mal and petit mal seizures. So she was no longer flying a plane, of course, but not even able to drive anymore either.
I see, knowing what I know about you, Elaine, you have some of that drive that your mother had. And she really had drive.
She did. She really did. She lived on her own up until probably about the last 5 years of her life. She had had a stroke and she had a brace on her leg, but she still wanted to be independent and live on her own. And one day I went to the house and I saw there was a scooter outside the house. And she lived on Janet Avenue, and the scooter was chained to the porch. And so I went in and I said, "Mother, whose scooter is that, and what or the plans for that? And she said, that's mine. She said, I bought it. She had a little flag on the top of it, and she would ride all over the town on that scooter, much to my dismay. But I learned that sometimes it's the quantity of life that's more important than the quality, I'm sorry, is more important than the quantity of life.
Absolutely. And she basically lived in what areas in Lancaster? I mean, there was city, right?
She lived in the city. We unfortunately lost our house, which was out in Grandview Heights, and as a result, she moved into North Pine Street for a little bit, East Orange Street for a while, South Ann Street, and then on to Janet Avenue, which is where she lived until there was a fire, and it was an arson fire next door to her house. She suffered from smoke inhalation, and she was no longer able to live on her own at that point.
But she really was a survivor with a lot of things. And we're going to take a break right now. We'll be right back with more of The Missing Piece.
LCTV 66 is your community channel, and your donations keep us on the air and help to produce more local programs. Send your tax-deductible donation of $500, $100, or more to the address on the screen. Or think of it this way: for the price of a couple of movie tickets, you can help support your community channel. Send what you can and be a part of all that is good about Lancaster County. Thank you for your tax-deductible donation to LCTV 66, Lancaster's Connection.
Welcome back to Behind the Lines. We're with Elaine Bledsoe, and she is the author of the working title of the book, The Missing Piece, having to do with the history of the Fulton and her mother back in the 1930s, who actually owned this, the Fulton Opera Company at the time. So we talked about some of the history and some of her travels and all these wonderful things that she did, but she dealt with a lot of issues that I think are really important to address, and that has to do with domestic violence. Tell us about this.
Absolutely. My one of the biggest reasons why my mother was unable to continue with the administration of the Fulton Opera House is because of what happened to my sister. My sister was 13 years older than I was, and she had met a man who worked at Jones and Laughlin Steel with her. She fell in love with him and found herself pregnant. She went away to a home for unwed mothers, had the baby, and gave it up for adoption. And when she came back, she made the decision with the man to move to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. She had found out too late during the pregnancy that he was already married. He had a family in Ohio. So they went to Baton Rouge, living together as a husband and wife. And one Saturday morning, I missed her terribly because I was extremely close to her. One Saturday morning, I was watching cartoons. I was about 11 years old. And I heard some voices in my mother's bedroom, but that wasn't unusual to have the door closed because she suffered from bipolar disorder and was often prone to going to bed for 6 weeks at a time. A man came downstairs that I did not recognize, and he said, "Elaine, your mother wants to see you." So I walked up the stairs, and I just had this very odd feeling. When I went into the room, the blinds were closed. My mother was leaning up against the headboard, and she patted a place next to her on the bed and said, "Come here, Elaine." I climbed up on the bed, and she said, "You know how every night you pray that Shirley will come home?" I said, "Yes." And she said, "She's coming home tomorrow." And I was just so excited because I really missed her, and I thought, she's coming home. And then she delivered the news. She's dead. They're sending her body back tomorrow. It was so crushing. And I learned that day that those headlines you see in the newspaper don't always happen to somebody else. Sometimes they come right into your living room. And that was a hard lesson to learn at age 11. This is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And that happened 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. And the statistics still are that the most dangerous times for a woman are when she tries to leave and when she's pregnant. My sister was homesick, and when she tried to leave her boyfriend, he killed her and killed himself. And when the neighbors saw the newspapers piling up at the doorstep, they called the police and they found their bodies in there. And there was a little rabbit hopping around. And I feel very sure she was bringing it home to me for Easter because she had gotten me a rabbit another time several years before that. So that was so traumatic for my mother. I don't think any parent ever gets over losing a child. And at that point, it sent her really into such a state of depression. She was never able to climb back out of it. But she did, years later, manage to get a job, and she would hold them down until she'd have a seizure. And it was before the American Disabilities Act, and whenever she'd have a seizure, she would lose her job. But it also sent me on the path of working with domestic violence services and survivors of domestic violence for many years since then.
And when your mother had remarried, your stepfather,
Yes.
there was an experience with you with that.
My stepfather was an alcoholic. He was extremely abusive. He was abusive to my mother. He was abusive to me. My mother would go to bed, as I mentioned, because she would be so depressed. And she was on the second floor. He kind of was left to his own devices with me. And if I did anything he didn't like, he would beat me. He would lock me down in the dark basement and tell me that if I didn't stop crying, so my mother couldn't hear me upstairs, that he would give me something to cry about. He was physically, mentally, emotionally, and sexually abusive to me as well.
How long was that period? Or how old were you then?
She married him when I was about 5. And when I finally had the words to tell her what he had been doing, I was probably about 14. And then by that time we had lost our house to back taxes. He had spent all her money, and we were no longer with him, and she never saw him again. They never got a divorce, but he did remarry.
Okay. When I look at what you've written so far, I also see a survivor's story. So much getting through all of this. And I think that's also what your message is when you're involved with domestic violence.
It is.
Surviving.
It is.
And how you cope and how you get through it.
Absolutely, it is. It is not easy. You have to be really determined. You have to try to look for all the good things in life, and have to learn how to solve problems. I was told one time that I was a very good problem solver by someone, a professional, and I had a lot of practice with it. But in the later years, I felt like I was the parent and my mother was the child. But she still had such a resilience and continued to strive to be independent in spite of everything she had been through.
Yeah. When I listen and we talk about what she did in the time period that she did.
Oh, absolutely.
For a woman.
Yes.
What a role model.
Oh, yes. She was such a role model, an absolute role model. And I have to say that her entire family was like that. Her oldest sister used to say she wasn't going to get married until she was 50. That way, if she made a mistake, she didn't have long to live with it. And she really did not get married until she was 50. Most of my relatives all worked up into their 70s, early 80s. So fabulous role models, both the women and the men in my mother's family.
I'm sure it's been fascinating for you doing this research that you're doing for the book, and the relatives and the stories behind all of this. Anything else you want to add that we might not have covered right now?
I think everybody has a story. There's so much more that I can't really include in this book because it is focused on my mother and the Fulton, but so many other stories that I think are relevant with her first husband and some of the situations he was in before he even came to Lancaster and my mother and he got married. I think the biggest message here is the fact that there was a woman in the history of the Fulton who has been overlooked, who really kept it going for over 20 years. And the fact that the added story that domestic violence does not have to be the end, that there's always, you know, a new beginning the next day, and there's help out there that you can get if you need it.
Let's say your mother's name.
Her name was Grace Black. That was her maiden name. Then it was Grace Finch. And at the time of her death, it was Grace Howard. That was her third husband.
I love the name Grace with this.
My granddaughter is named Grace.
Wow. Now, with this book that you're writing and whatever else you may end up doing as the path goes, how do we find out more? Or how do we get a hold of you? Or what should we be looking for?
Well, at the moment, I don't have a website for this, but I obviously think I should have. If anyone is interested in contacting me through my email, they certainly can do that. Would you like my email address?
Go ahead and give it.
All right. I own a company called Golden Eagle Enterprises, so my email is G and the word Eagle, EAGLE, ENT@comcast.net.
Okay, so that's the way we can reach out to you.
That's how you can reach out to me, yes.
Okay. Thank you for coming on, and thank you for sharing these experiences and bringing to light a piece of history we didn't even know about.
You are quite welcome. Thank you for having me. I just did not want to have this go unnoticed. She really deserves that part in history.
Absolutely, and I'm glad we can give it to her, and hopefully more people will find out. And who knows what you're going to do with some of these other artifacts and things like that
Absolutely.
down the road. So remember the name, Elaine Bledsoe, and remember Grace Finch, Grace
Howard. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here
You're
today.
welcome.
Thank you for joining me today on Behind the Lines. I'm Diane Dayton, and remember to look behind the lines. You might be surprised what you find.